Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It's Monday, September 1st, 2025. On Mondays, we talk about math and statistics. Welcome to September. Back to school. Well, this week we're talking about resilience. And so, how does one measure resilience from a statistical standpoint? Well, as with any concept, at least from a scientific perspective, first challenge is defining what you mean by the phenomenon that you're talking about. And then you have to create an operational measure or indicator of the thing that you hope to study. So, a thermometer, for example, is simply a technology that's used to measure temperature. And that's based on the principle of thermal expansion, usually with a liquid that expands or contracts depending on whether it's heated or cooled. And so that allows you to tell the temperature. And so that same logic applies to, as I say, any scientific concept you might be interested in, including resilience. And that's been defined and measured in a variety of different ways within the social sciences, especially focusing on individuals as such. But you can even study resilience at the collective or societal level, if you will. So, for example, this is what I just want to talk a little bit more about today. The Canadian Index of Social Resilience and the Canadian Index of Social Vulnerability were both designed to assess an area's social resilience, that is, a community's or whole geographic region's area of social, their vulnerability to possible natural hazards and disasters. And so in Canada and beyond, of course, these include wildfires and floods, earthquakes and severe storms, and so on. And these events obviously not only damage the infrastructure of different communities, but they often end up displacing huge numbers of residents and straining and sometimes destroying local economies. And so natural hazards then become disasters when their effects basically overwhelm the community's resources and their ability to cope. And that, of course, then necessitates external supports from emergency management services. And countries around the world, of course, have these emergency management services. And they're absolutely vital to sustaining communities across the different regions of the world and ensuring their resiliency, their ability then to bounce back. Okay? And so the thing is that we know too that disasters disproportionately affect certain groups, certain communities more than others. And the disproportionate impacts are dependent upon a combination of different demographic and socioeconomic, ethnocultural, and structural aspects that people encounter as individuals and communities. And so that's why it's important to understand why or which communities in particular are more likely to experience relatively larger negative impacts from natural hazards and disasters. And so then that information is then used or can be used to contribute to the development of emergency preparedness. And for that matter, disaster risk reduction. Okay? And so that's incredibly important when you're looking at things at a more societal or collective level. And of course, there are so many different government agencies and community organizations and different stakeholders that contribute to our ability to effectively respond to natural disasters. And so, social resilience and social vulnerability are highly related and yet distinct concepts that can help predict a community's circumstances before, during, and after a hazardous event. So, in the context of natural hazards, social resilience then focuses on the strengths within a community and the resources that can support their ability to prepare for, adapt to, and withstand and hopefully recover rapidly from the disruptions that are caused by natural hazards. In contrast, social vulnerability refers to the susceptibility of a community to the impacts, the adverse effects of natural hazards. And so, through the process of assembling and analyzing relevant social and economic and physical attributes at the appropriate scale, we've created measures of social resilience and social vulnerability that can help inform and provide a more complete picture of the community's potential in response to whatever possible disruptions may occur. So, in sum, basically what we're saying is that understanding social resilience and social vulnerability can help to identify which communities are more likely to bear greater social burdens following hazardous events, and then which might be, therefore, we'd be wise to better target them for support during all phases of the potential emergency that might, and the disaster planning that might be required. So the big challenge then, in terms of examining social resilience and vulnerability, is determining what are the optimal statistical indicators to comprehensively measure these concepts. And that's the bane of our existence in science, and especially the social sciences. So what we do is we typically then create composite indexes as our main solution by combining various factors at a particular point in space and time that contribute to a single, or there are different dimensions that help contribute to an overall measure, right, of a single concept, such as looking at a combination of demographic characteristics, so socioeconomic statuses, education, and health. And so the Canadian Index of Social Resilience and the Canadian Index of Social Vulnerability then were developed specifically as composite indexes to examine the social aspects of resilience and vulnerability from natural disasters of any kind. And so this becomes especially important in a world in which global climate change and related factors increasingly have the potential to impact and disrupt and even destroy communities and the lives or what's happening to thousands or even millions of people living in a given area. And so the point is that at the individual level, it's one thing if a severe storm, for example, comes along and a tree falls on your house as a result, doing some damage. And then that usually boils down to kind of what you can do as an individual in terms of your own resources or your insurance company, right? And maybe the goodwill of a couple of nice neighbors. But it's quite a different issue if that storm, however, ends up knocking out the power supply for the entire community, or if there's massive flooding accompanying the disaster. So then it's not an individual problem, but rather a community or a collective problem. And so that's often much more difficult or challenging then for people to understand. We're much better at individualizing problems and then putting the responsibility of how to respond to life's or nature's challenge on the individual. If something bad happens to someone, then just focus then on their situation, their responsibility, their resources, and hopefully they'll figure out how to cope. But if that bad thing affects lots of people, then the responsibility and the responses become a bit murkier, a bit more complicated. Situations obviously more complex, with various multiple parameters that combine to affect large swaths of people. So if I've lost power in my home, the grid's been knocked out or what have you, how do I recover from that? It's not just an individual problem. I mean, from an individual perspective, what one would say is that, well, I might have been well advised then to have purchased a generator, for example, as a backup, and maybe a month's supply of resources, food and water, etc., the necessities to ensure my long-term survival. But even if I've done that, there's no guarantee that the power supply is going to be fixed or restored in a timely manner. And that's in part a direct function of where I live. So in other words, the resiliency of the power supply and the grid depends, at least in part, on the resources that are available, not just at my level, but at the community or the regional level. And that's not a function, again, of my individual abilities or resources. So again, that's why in Canada, we've invested at least some of our resources then in developing both the Canadian Index of Social Resilience and the Canadian Index of Social Vulnerability. It's simply one mathematical or statistical tool that can be used then to help us prepare for the potential hazards or catastrophes that could afflict communities anywhere across Canada. And based on the indicators, Public Safety Canada and the policing services and a range of other stakeholders can then determine what resources would be needed and should be available to communities across the country, regardless of where they are, and in terms of their capacities then to face up to catastrophes in a more effective and efficient way. So again, no one wants to face wildfires or floods or natural disasters, but I, for one, at least, am quite pleased that we've got some really smart people working on these issues that are doing the planning, trying to figure out more effective responses to help communities anywhere in the country in case something horrible happens. So at the collective level, from families to communities to whole societies and whole nations, we really do need to take a good, hard, empirical look at the issues that we're confronted with and plan accordingly. So in effect, resiliency actually is something that we can build into our systems, just like training and planning at the individual level creates more resilience for an athlete. The same logic then applies at the collective level. Okay, so I hope this has been a helpful perspective, at least, on resilience at the collective level, where we can use community and global information to help plan more effectively, so we don't end up with communities that end up completely collapsing or unable to recover in the face of natural disasters. All right, as ever, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, and dole out hugs in abundance. Peace.